Tuesday edition of 596B presentations. We have a full slate today. So our first presenter will have 15 minutes for presentation, 5 minutes for questions and answers. For the questions, if you could read the question that comes in the chat afterwards, that'd be great.
Awesome.
And I think we're ready to go here. So first up, Raul Lamas is going to give his capstone presentation on fast casual restaurants, race, and poverty, a geographic weighted regression approach. Raul, whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hey, everybody. My name is Raul Llamas, and first I'd like to thank my advisor, Stephen Matthews, for all his help with my project and guidance throughout the entire process. My capstone project is titled Fast Casual Restaurants, Race, and Poverty, a Geographic Weighted Regression Approach. So the first problem or question that I'm looking at is, are fast casual restaurants making siting decisions that exclude low income and minority populations? So some background on this, many studies have shown that fast food restaurants are linked to unhealthy outcomes for consumers. In a spatial context, correlations between the locations of these restaurants and the health of the people in the area have been found as well. But looking at the makeup of the members of these communities, one study has shown a correlation with fast food restaurants at low-income residents. That's in the images that you can see. There have also been findings that show that race can be an indicator of more fast food restaurants in an urban setting. The location of fast food restaurants and the location of grocery stores have been looked at extensively, primarily showing healthier outcomes near grocery stores and unhealthy outcomes with fast food restaurants as the only option. This is understandable as people will eat from the places that are near them. The lack of a grocery store can leave fast food restaurants as one of the only options. This is a widely studied phenomenon known as a food desert, in which an area is without a grocery store and the access to healthy food is limited. There has been so much research done into this topic, but the common theme of the problem that is being approached is measuring the access of healthy food in a spatial context. So for my research, fast casual restaurants, on the other hand, are an area of food consumption that have not been studied as extensively, much less the correlation of their locations of the communities that they serve. This could be due to the relative novelty of fast casual restaurants as they have risen in popularity over the past 20 years in the United States, and a growth from a regional to a national reach in a more recent time frame. A fast casual restaurant is commonly defined as offering a dining experience with fresh ingredients, quick service, and an average cost of under $10, similar to fast food, but with the fresh ingredients and the healthier type of food. So why fast casual restaurants? I believe there's a specific void that this study can fulfill. Fast casual restaurants are missing in these studies, and I believe that they can add to the research showing inequality in healthy food options. Ideally, all fast casual restaurants would be included in this type of study. However, judging what the restaurant qualifies as one can lead to arbitrary decisions, which can cause missing or excessive data. For this study, I plan to focus on just one specific chain, Chipotle. This restaurant chain currently has over 2,500 locations currently in the United States. And a national chain with this many locations is an ideal fit, as it can serve as the representative of a modern and successful fast casual restaurant. So like I said, they've been included in many analyses regarding race or poverty, but they've mostly focused on grocery stores in terms of food deserts and fast food restaurants, and they offer the healthier option. So this project will require two essential sets of data: the location of the fast casual restaurants, Chipotle, and the demographic data for the communities that they are in. I use Chipotle's website to create a set of points based on the location of the restaurants that fall within the area of study. For the demographic data, I use the data from the American Community Survey, which is a program under the United States Census Bureau. The scale of the data for this project is at the zip code level, and there are two reasons for this selection over the census tract level. One is that there is more recent demographic data for this scale, allowing for a larger variety of possible variables. The other reason is that census tracts may be too small and not envelop the entire neighborhood. So they could exclude residents if the Chipotle location is in more of a business district. Zip codes will do a better job of including residents in these business districts. The three demographic variables that I ended up using were Black population, Latino population, and a percent of households with SNAP benefits. Latinos and Blacks were the two largest minority groups by a significant margin in the city of Houston. And I chose SNAP benefits because not only was it a way to track lower income, but these households would have food costs lowered with these benefits and have a larger possibility of spending money at a restaurant. So the first step in trying to answer this question for me was to naturally make a map of the data. Here we have the percentage of Black population and Chipotle locations in Metro Houston. One of the first things you notice is the pattern of the Chipotle locations. They exclude the outer, more rural ring, but also the eastern portion of the inner city. You can also see the more heavily populated areas with the Black population to be without Chipotles. That's noted here in the northeast side and in the southwest. So you start to see a pattern of like, okay, maybe they are excluding certain populations. Now, the Latino map has a similar makeup with the heavier concentrated areas appearing to be without Chipotles. The original question I posed is beginning to look like it may have some traction. You see the heavily populated Latino areas here and here, and they do not have Chipotles. And the pattern is just a little striking. You definitely see the Chipotles going along highways, which is expected, but the fact that it just excludes a large portion of the inner city is concerning. With the SNAP variable, you start to see a larger pattern of Chipotles in the less impoverished areas. The eastern portion of town has higher SNAP percentages. Just by looking at these maps, you can start to see a pattern. It's so same as the previous two slides with lower income neighborhoods being in the eastern portion of the city. And this one is a little bit more, you can just see it a little bit more with the higher income areas having the Chipotles, and it's almost like even like a, you know, like the weird, the locations of those like almost just like pick out like, right, it's like a Chipotle here, a Chipotle here, a Chipotle here, and it's like, how is it in these areas, right? So after visualizing the data, let's take a look at the composition of these zip codes. I created a basic comparison chart showing the zip codes with and without Chipotles and their mean values. SNAP households nearly double in zip codes with no Chipotle. Latino and Black populations show a difference here and here, but it is smaller. So visually there seems to be a pattern, and looking at these numbers, you kind of support that just by looking at what the composition of these zip codes. But the last variable you may not recognize that is it is new. The last variable here is restaurant count. It is drastically different, showing a huge jump in the zip codes with Chipotle than those without, from 26.38 to 9, right? This is a variable that we have to look at. You see, in order for a geographic weighted regression model to work, it needs to check for consistencies that are supported by the data. We need these consistencies to be ones that a Chipotle would make to really be able to look at the variables I want to examine. This is the toughest part of the project, determine the correct model. After I downloaded my data and parsed through different variables, I used the MGIS software made by the Arizona State University Spatial Department. The first step was determining the model type for this data. I had to choose between binomial, Gaussian, and Poisson. My outcome variable was Chipotle locations. And as much as I wanted to use a more intense model like Poisson and Gaussian, my Chipotle data had very low counts. Nearly all the zip codes had either 1 or 0, and a small handful had 2. This data was pretty much already binary, so I chose a binomial logistic geographic weighted regression as my model. Next, I had to build out the model to be as accurate as possible within my limits of data and project scope. I knew I wanted the race and income variables in there, but I needed a way to make the model relevant to real world decisions. Here's where I added 2 variables that would be part of the site selection process for Chipotle: access and busyness. Highway presence in a zip code would act as the access variable, and total restaurant count would account for the busy area. My hypothesis at this point is that yes, Chipotles are going to be near highways, and busier areas will have Chipotles, as that would mean more people or at least customers. So after running the model, the most important results of my project were the individual variable results, specifically which were significant and then their correlation to their Chipotle locations. Restaurant count showed perfect significance with a 0.00 p-value as expected. Highway presence has a very low p-value as well, showing significance. So the more site selection variables are proven to be effective. The SNAP variable did show a high significance as well, supporting the data that we had been seeing earlier. The 2 race variables, however, showed no significance through this process. And through this process and model, we can rule out the correlation between these variables and locations of Chipotle. So here we have a map of the results. Here we have the geographic weighted regression binomial, significant beta coefficients of Chipotle locations, and total restaurants per zip code in metropolitan Houston, Texas. This map shows the correlation between the total restaurants per zip code, and the correlation is stronger in the eastern portions of the inner city and the areas in the southern portion of the metro area. These are where the beta coefficients are at its absolute highest, thus having a stronger effect. There's a section in the northeast portion right here of the map that shows up as white. This has been masked out as a non-significant portion of the map. I use a t-statistic masking method where zip codes that fall within negative 1.96 and positive 1.96 are insignificant, and values higher than those are significant. So altogether, this map shows correlation via the beta coefficients and significance with the t-statistic masking. The next map shows this masking far more dramatically, as only a few zip codes showed up as significant with the snap variable. This creates a less aesthetically pleasing map, but does show us which poorer areas are victims to the absence of a Chipotle despite having a busy area. So these are the only ones that showed up as significant zip codes that had correlation from a significant variable. So all in all, the results in this are, the results from this study is that there is a slight correlation between lower income areas and an absence of a Chipotle. There is a strong correlation between busy areas and the presence of a Chipotle. And there is no correlation between minority populations and the absence of a Chipotle. It wasn't a site selection project, but rather wanted to look at the results of the site selection process restaurants like Chipotle make. And despite there appearing to be a pattern and a possible correlation by visualizing and seeing a statistical comparison of the variables in the Chipotle locations, they are shown as not significant with this type of analysis. Some of the challenges that I faced in this project were the nighttime population versus daytime population. The ACS data only accounted for people that lived in those zip codes, but did not track commuters or people that could be possible customers. Another issue with this type of data is the margin of error that it holds. You know, I didn't sample it, so I just kind of have to take the margin of error as it is. Culinarity was also a thing I had to worry about because I wanted to use more variables like health outcomes and different types of, you know, other types of ways to measure income or specifically to measure income. But there's a lot of culinarity with these variables and they collided. Missing data for zip codes also made certain variables unavailable. I had a commuter time variable that I really wanted to use, but it had a lot of, it was missing a lot, so I couldn't really use it. And since the census tract data would not work for this project because I needed to envelop entire neighborhoods, and census tract data was easier to get, which was unfortunate. So future studies for this are how other metropolitan areas could behave. This could include just like the racial makeup of these cities and where people are located, to even just like access some a city like New York, you know, where you don't have highways, you have to change the model to maybe be public transportation or, you know, just or bigger roads. Another way to improve this study would be to properly identify all restaurants that can qualify as a healthier option. Or what I originally kind of wanted to do was a temporal study of how neighborhood changes from having a fast casual restaurant. So almost like you see that, like, you know, as a neighborhood gets a Chipotle in 2017, how does it look from 2015 to 2020? The problem with this was figuring out when these Chipotles were actually open. And yeah, that just had a lot of other issues, but it would be very interesting to see this play forward. So yeah, I think that's it. I'd like to take questions now.
Well, thanks for your presentation, Ro. That's very interesting. Have to, every time I drive by a Chipotle now, I'll have to consider its siting and relevance to the surrounding neighborhoods. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I did have something that I wanted to see if you'd thought about. Of course, building a restaurant requires land, property, and so forth. Did you consider at all sort of how to incorporate that, you know, property availability, square footage, as part of your research?
Yeah, so that was kind of like the major part of this project was the model building, but it wasn't a site selection process, as more of just seeing the results of it. So I'm not looking for like where to put a Chipotle, just kind of seeing where are there Chipotles and how, you know, what are the neighborhood makeups of it. So I wasn't looking as much as the, you know, where will they build one, right? So I used the just as like a busy area for competition to just kind of overall envelop some of the decisions that they would make. But yeah, the like land usage would definitely be an issue if you have a zip code that doesn't have a lot of area to put a restaurant, or like zoning.
Yeah, I'm sure most of these fast food franchises have specific, building footprint models that they go by to figure out where to place their structures.
Right.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions for Raul?
Do you think your results would be similar for different kinds of restaurants, less healthy fast food type like McDonald's or fancier eateries? Yeah, so that's definitely another possible future study of more of a comparison. More of a comparison study where you look at McDonald's and Chipotle's as two different models and see if the significance, see if the correlations match up at all. Let's see, another question. Could you explain a bit more about how significance is derived from a GWR model? Was it the MGIS help you with that, or did you find a method separately? So yeah, if this was a Poisson or a Gaussian model, the local R2 would have been incredibly efficient for showing just the fit of the model. But with the logistic model, I went with the p-values. The MGWR software gave that as a result, along with the individual beta coefficients for the variables. So I looked at the p-values just to see, all right, so which models show significance, and then out of those, I displayed the results using the beta coefficients as their correlation. I hope that answered the question. But I did use the MGWR software for that.
All right, Raul, if you could put your email in the chat window, if anyone has any follow-up questions, they can contact you that way.
Awesome, thank you guys so much. And thank you so much, Stephen.
And then when you're ready, if you could stop sharing and let our next presenter, Andrew Fahey, line things up.
Alrighty, let's see here. This screen. Can everybody hear me okay for one
We
thing?
can hear you and we can see your screen.
Okay, and with that, let me pop this into the present mode. And I remember from my proposed presentation to fix this. You should see the actual presentation, not just my notes.
And we do, so you're good to go.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andy Fahey. I'm going to be giving a presentation on education and public health regression models at the county scale. A little bit about myself. My background is actually in ecology and agriculture, both in my education, my undergrads in agroecology, and my work is with the USDA in the same field. So I was kind of interested in exploring something new while learning about regression analysis. And so I'll be discussing essentially why I got interested in this project and why it's important, the study area and data analysis involved, two regression model types that were used, OLS and GWR, and I'll use those to contextualize education's involvement in the equation. And I'll discuss three main challenges I think this audience might be interested to hear about because they're more general issues. So education and health are important to us, both individually and on a population scale. They're both huge time investments and fiscal investments as well. And it's a well-known relationship between education and health. That the higher degree that you have, generally the better health or longer life that you have. And it is causal, yes, so says the literature, but how much gets kind of iffy based off of multiple reasons. Most importantly to me is where and at what scale we're looking at. And so how does geography fit? Well, geography has had an increasing focus in the literature. There's plenty of international and national studies out there, but states have been more commonly assessed nowadays as well, considering the heterogeneous landscape of the US, for example. But even finer scales like counties contextualize a relationship more regardless of what relationship you're looking at. And so take, for example, figure 1, we see life expectancy is very high in California, but once you break it down to the counties, you see it's really the coast that's driving up that number because of how populated those areas are. But in the context of this relationship, looking at the counties hasn't really been done as often or really much at all. And so why is this important? Well, two driving reasons that are not mutually exclusive can help with policy decisions and with resource management on the governance aspect. And then academia can help discern patterns for future studies and highlight geography's importance. And so I basically had two research goals here, to explore the county level correlation pattern. And then the second is to compare local and global regression models at the county scale. I did have a third objective initially, a state versus county comparison, but the PSU Stats Consulting Center proposed that would be kind of faulty because of how it was structured. Specifically, I was looking at two different states, only two states. Why did I pick Missouri and Illinois? I read one paper in my literature review that showed an educational disparity changing over time between Illinois and Missouri. And I just kind of recognize, well, St. Louis is right there in that cleft in between Missouri and Illinois. And Chicago is a massive metropolitan area that spans some 14 counties and actually bleeds into Wisconsin and Indiana as well. So I was just curious, well, what does this look like at the county scale? I didn't include a time element in here, but this is what prompted my interest. And so looking at the data, my primary data source was the University of Wisconsin Public Health Institute county health rankings. I would encourage you guys to check that out if you're looking for county health data, because they aggregate their data from authoritative sources, mostly federal. And they have county scale data that you might not easily be able to find as an individual. And it's all in a one-stop shop, so definitely check them out. And I used health outcomes. I used two different health outcomes as my dependent variables. I used mortality and fair and poor health. And so you can kind of think of this as me doing the project twice. You might wonder why. Well, both of those were heavily used in the literature I was seeing. And I didn't know enough about the field to kind of weigh one over the other. And actually saw mortality as kind of a more objective measure and self-reported fair and poor health as a more subjective measure. So I thought that was kind of an interesting try to grab both. Educational attainment is a 5-year estimate from 2015 to 2019 from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey. And I focused on 5 levels of credential attainment: no/some high school, associate's degree, and some college. And I couldn't separate those two, bachelor's and graduate and above. And then there's other health related factors that the University of Wisconsin supplied. And I was going to use those to be determined using exploratory regression, or what's also called stepwise regression. And so I did that in JUMP, and I'll circle back why I use JUMP specifically. And what that does is systematically checks each variable and adds them to determine the model with the best goodness of fit. And I used the Kike's information criterion, or AIC, to measure that goodness of fit, since it's a common method in regression analyses. And then I did an OLS in JUMP and then verified that it was giving me the same output in ArcGIS. So that was kind of a safe thing. And that gives a predictive model. It takes input X variables that I got from the stepwise regression, however many that might be. It sees how much they explain the variation and why. And why in this case, again, is mortality and fair and poor health. So this is 2 different equations going on here. And GWR takes it a step further. It runs essentially an OLS model, for the purposes of this conversation, an OLS model for each county. And it's influenced solely by those neighbors around it that I, the user, specify. And that's why it's quote unquote a local model. It has input parameters such as either distance, bandwidth, or number of neighbors. And I just redid it to get the lowest AIC, but knowing that there's 9 counties in Chicago metropolitan area, that might be a significant number for some people, but I just went with the lowest one because I wanted to see how that looked. The results of this, starting with the model overview, there's a lot going on in this table a little bit. The left column in gray is the summary statistics of the relevant regression models. On the left side of the table, we see that we have mortality, and on the right side we have fair and poor health and their corresponding OLS and GWR outputs. And so what are the takeaways here? Well, in red, we see that the AIC is not different for mortality. A difference of 3 is the rule of thumb for less fit, and you always want a lower AIC. And it's not like a target number thing, it's just a comparison between models. And the lowest AIC I could get was with 17 neighbors, but because it wasn't different, and also because of time constraints here, I'm actually going to be focusing on fair and poor health. The second thing to highlight is this co-anchor statistic in yellow, which measures something called skedasticity, or spatial stationarity. And the fact that it's significant means that this distribution is displaying heteroskedasticity. That's residuals are showing an increasing or a non-continuous variation. And that's actually breaking an assumption of OLS. However, ArcGIS actually supplies you with what's called a ward statistic, which is highlighted in green, and then robust variable probabilities to compensate for this. So the fact that the yellow is alarming, but the fact that I still have the green means that we're still good here. And in fact, it's actually a good opportunity for GWR because it's highlighting that space. Space is important here. And so looking at the GWR for fair and poor health, we see it has a higher R squared. It does better to explain the variation. It also has a lower AIC by about 15. This is with 41 neighbors specifically. Now we'll circle back on this a little bit. I'm interested in this discussion is that I couldn't necessarily find literature discussing significance of GWR, and that was a central challenge with my research. And so looking at the OLS, this is somewhat of a dense table as well. But from this table of OLS variables from the stepwise regression, we see that the coefficients make sense. They're all telling parts of the story that you would expect. Specifically, associate's degree in some college was a meaningful education variable that was pulled into the OLS, but it was contributing negatively to fair and poor health, which is actually a double negative. So this is a good thing that's happening. It's also the most impactful negative coefficient. It's doing the most to reduce fair and poor health, which is good. And then the variables are significant as well, looking at the robust probability there. They're all telling important parts of the story. And one thing to note was that no/some high school was actually captured in the regression model, but it ultimately wasn't significant. I guess he just got beaten out by associate's degree. And then the last aspect is the VIF, which measures multicollinearity, shows that these variables are all telling different parts of the story, which is something necessary. And this distribution, this is a distribution of standardized residuals. Highlighted in green, there are two outliers. They're outliers because they're standardized residuals. And feel free to ignore the letters. They're just, these are images pulled from my paper directly. And so we run into an issue where we have spatial autocorrelation. It's significantly clustered in this OLS model. And unfortunately, alternatives couldn't really be found to get rid of the spatial autocorrelation as hard as I tried. So I kind of just had to swallow it and keep going, which was unfortunate. And we still have a normal distribution of residuals as seen in this QQ plot, which is one of the assumptions of OLS, so we're good there. And we also have a normal distribution of residuals around 0, which is something else that we want. But you might see here that as you go from left to right, you see a greater variance of the points. And that's actually what's called, that's the heteroskedasticity. And that's what the Conquer statistic is measuring and why we use the robust stats and the word statistic that we did. And why GWR can kind of weigh in on this a little bit more. And so here's a map of the standardized residuals in there. I didn't include a figure in here, but there is no spatial autocorrelation on this front. We see that the model does better at explaining fair and poor health as we move south. And then we have two distinct kind of blobs going on that have actually lower explanation than the OLS. And both seem to be in between the three main cities of Kansas City and St. Louis and Chicago, which is an interesting trend. Here we have the predicted fair and poor health over space from the GWR, and there's three main takeaways I want to highlight here. One, there's a clear separation between Illinois and Missouri. Illinois in general is better off, which is the purple. Missouri is much more green, but not just that. The South Missouri seems to be doing worse than North Missouri because it has a deeper green. And then also, if you can see the three cities I highlighted, Chicago, St. Louis, and Kansas City in there, you see that those are actually all green, but areas around them are all purple. So the areas around the cities themselves are actually doing better off, which could just be suburbs, and they might just be more financially well off. However, we do run into a good lick of trouble here. This is what's called a condition number, which measures local multicollinearity. Not a mouthful. We had the VIF before for the global OLS. This measures essentially that. But on the local model. And 30 is considered high. So to say that we have an extremely high local multicollinearity is an understatement. And I'll circle back on that as a main challenge as well. But focusing on education here, this is a scatter plot matrix in the bottom left corner with a corresponding Pearson's R matrix in the top right. And the things that I want to highlight here, the two main takeaways, is that there is a clear dividing line between high school education and higher education as your highest credential attainment, and that it shows a general trend of decreasing mortality and fair and poor health with greater education. And again, note that associate's degree also captures some college, that might be weighing in here, but this is just the raw distribution of associate's degree and some college. But on the right, we see that there's a significant cluster of high rates of it in Southeast Illinois, and then a distinctive low cluster right across the border in Missouri in the Southeast there. But there's a noticeable difference between Illinois and Missouri as well, in that there is no low clusters in Illinois, and there's no high clusters in Missouri, which is interesting. And when we look at the associate's degree sum college coefficient in GWR, we see that's impact on fair and poor health varies across space, which we can expect. But specifically, we see at the fringes of the study area, the west border of Missouri and the north border of St. Louis kind of corresponds to the OLS model's weight in terms of how it impacts the model. But towards the center, that swath around St. Louis to the border of Kentucky shows a lower impact. But one thing to keep in mind, though, is that this could be different if I were to have included the neighboring states. It's something I thought of late in the project to maybe make like a buffer zone, because the bordering neighbors can only get their neighbors from one direction, whereas the center of the study area can get them from all directions. That might actually have weighed in on it. And so there's three main challenges I wanted to highlight. Without a means of actually testing against hypotheses, or at least I couldn't find literature that was talking about GWR highlighting significance testing against hypotheses. You might have to take your GWR with a grain of salt, and instead you would have to use it to help further your investigations by identifying problems, but ultimately it shouldn't get you to your final destination and shouldn't be done by itself. The other challenge I faced was local multicollinearity, which is a known issue with it. There's a bit of debate, but most literature agrees that GWR is sensitive to local multicollinearity, and that there's some methods being explored very recently to try and overcome that obstacle. And then the third aspect I wanted to highlight is that the project was originally intended to all be done in ArcGIS via the exploratory regression tool, but that actually has a calculation cap. And I had 47 variables. So even if I could whittle it down to, say, 15, I would still reach that cap generally, and would feel more uncertain, even if I could get something to work, than if I went in the direction I went, which was to use JUMP, the statistics software, and then transfer it over. But if I could do it all again, I would try and explore options like R or Geoda, or I just learned about MGWR from Raul, so thank you. And so that would be another way to go. And so in conclusion, education follows the same general trend as the extensive literature when using a scale not often looked at, namely counties. The OLS and the input variables showing that spatial sensitivity demonstrates further that geography should play a more active role in these types of statistical analyses, excuse me. And GWR should be suggestive in its interpretation rather than explicit based on the two issues I've highlighted. The lack of significance in hypothesis testing that I've been able to see, and local multicollinearity, which are both still active bodies of research going on. And with that, these are my references, and special thanks to Mike Nasri for advising into all these other folks. So thank you very much. And with that, I thank you very much for listening, and welcome any questions.
All right, Andrew, thanks for a great presentation. Glad to see JUMP is still around and in use.
It rocks.
Yeah.
If you guys haven't used it before.
Well, got a question up there already for you in the chat.
Let's see, nice talk about two analysis and prejudice mortality and GWR models with local models based on is very low, and also based on 9 independent variables. And B, also in self-reported health models, R2 is very high, less. Not sure that we should have to explain such multiplication. Team that beta coefficients and only those that are significant. So I'm trying to answer, well, two of these are comments. One of them is a question. I'll answer the question first. Did I map beta coefficients and only those that are significant? No, I just mapped the education one for the purposes of this presentation. But I didn't map that was just the only coefficient that I mapped, because my emphasis here is the education aspect. But I wasn't able to find necessarily one that was
what I would constitute statistically significant. You don't have those that are significant. I did not include it in the paper, no. That was just, my focus was on the education aspect. But I'm happy to talk more about this in particular because I want some help with GWR.
Can I quickly, can you hear me?
Yes, I
Basically, you created a map of the coefficients, but you didn't map those that are only significant. And so the places that are important are going to be those that are significant. The others aren't going to matter very much. But I actually think the other issues that I raised are actually the more important ones, especially the A. So that's the answer. That's the question I mainly have. Thank you. It's really good work. I just want you to be more nuanced and more practical in some of the things you've decided to, how you've analyzed the data.
No, I understand that and I appreciate it. And I'd actually be very willing to talk about this a bit more with you to try and understand a bit more of how to digest this stuff. Because like I said, this was kind of a new venture for me. So ran into a lot of roadblocks there, but I do really value your inputs. Thank you. Do I think my results would be different if I had used different variables for health and education? Are those that you would consider but decide against using? Yes, education, I did kind of want to use other variables because credential attainment doesn't necessarily tell you how good of an education you have. But I couldn't necessarily find easily publicly available data at the county scale for quality of education, for example. That would be the one that I would kind of want to get. For health, the University of Wisconsin, what I downloaded, I just used pretty much every variable they could give me. So I had 42 variables, not including the 5 levels of credential attainment. That included things like obesity or health behavior variables, environment, access to care, quality of care, those sorts of things. So I like to think that I did a good comprehensive look at the health stuff. But in terms of dependent variables, I just used mortality and self-reported fair and poor health because those were what I saw most in the literature when I was looking at doing this as a project. Of course, thank you.
All right. Any other questions for Andrew? All right, Andrew, thanks again for the great presentation.
Of course, thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.
Let's see, next up is Matt Martin. So Matt, if you want to start sharing your screen. All right, we see your screen.
All right, can you hear me?
Little low on the volume, but
Let's see. That any better?
yeah, we're good. We're good.
Okay.
So whenever you're ready, Matt, go ahead and take it away.
My presentation is titled A GIS Approach to Coral Reef Restoration Site Selection. Let's start with some background info on corals. Corals are animals belonging to the phylum Cnidaria, along with sea anemones and jellyfish. They're made up of colonies of polyps with symbiotic algae called zooxanthellae living in their tissues. These polyps take in nutrients from food and seawater to build up a hard calcium carbonate skeleton. And this hard calcareous skeleton accumulates over long periods of time to form coral reefs. Coral reef ecosystems primarily occur in tropical environments and are one of the most biologically diverse ecosystems on Earth. For this reason, they are frequently called the rainforests of the sea. An estimated 25% of marine species depend on coral reefs. They provide over $3.4 billion in value to the U.S. economy every year, and around 500 million people depend on coral reefs for food, income, and coastal protection. There are numerous environmental parameters that influence coral survival. Turbidity and sedimentation must be low. Salinity and temperature must be stable and maintained within a narrow range. Nutrient input must be low, and there must be high light availability for photosynthesis. There are numerous threats impacting coral reefs across the world. Some of these threats include increasing ocean temperatures from global warming, ocean acidification, overfishing, invasive species, and coastal development, which frequently leads to pollution, runoff, and erosion. Not all threats to coral reefs are man-made. Natural events such as hurricanes can have severe impacts on coral reefs, but as stressors mount, the reef loses its ability to recover from these events. Several methods of restoring coral reefs have been developed. The most common method is called coral farming or gardening. With this method, healthy wild coral colonies are clipped and the fragments are grown in coral nurseries. Once they're grown to a sufficient size, the coral colonies are outplanted into degraded reefs, where they will hopefully continue to grow and reproduce. Coral reef restoration projects face several challenges. Most restoration projects are performed by volunteers and nonprofit organizations. Due to this, there is a lack of scientific input in restoration efforts. Some people argue that conservation is more important than restoration, and restoration is a waste of time and money. Another challenge involves the lack of genetic variability in outplanted corals. Unless care is taken to collect fragments from multiple genetically distinct coral colonies, all of the outplanted corals could have identical genetic makeup. Coral diseases can also wreak havoc on coral nurseries, destroying fragments before they get outplanted. The objectives for this project were to develop a GIS-focused approach to reef restoration site selection and to enhance coral reef restoration efforts in the Florida Keys by selecting locations for restoration that provide the highest likelihood for coral outplant survival. 8 different environmental parameters were analyzed in this project. These parameters are sea surface temperature, ocean currents, land use, hydrology, mooring buoys, bathymetry, seafloor substrate, and turbidity. All of the data layers were projected in the Albers conical equal area projection with a resolution of 500 meters. As mentioned previously, sea surface temperature suitability is very important, or stability is very important for coral survival. Sea surface temperature data was acquired from the University of South Florida College of Marine Sciences Optical Oceanography Laboratory. This data was a spreadsheet of point data derived from NOAA MODIS Aqua satellite imagery. A point layer was created from the spreadsheet and interpolated into a raster. In addition to sea surface temperature variability, periods of excessively high sea surface temperature were also evaluated. It has been found that the temperature threshold for coral bleaching in the Florida Keys is 30.5 degrees Celsius. Extended time spent over this threshold greatly increases the likelihood for coral bleaching. The spreadsheet previously acquired includes the number of weeks spent above the bleaching threshold within a span of 2 years. Similarly to sea surface temperature variability, this data was imported into ArcGIS Pro as a point layer and interpolated into a raster covering the Florida Keys. Ocean current data was acquired from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Ocean currents can have positive and negative effects on coral survival, since they can carry harmful sediments, pollution, and fresh water from rivers and streams, but they also carry food, coral gametes, and larvae to the reef. The primary current that flows through the Florida Keys comes from the open ocean, and therefore is unlikely to carry harmful sediment, pollution, or fresh water to the area's reefs. Land use data was evaluated to account for the effects of human activity in the Florida Keys. This data was acquired from the Florida Geographic Data Library as a polygon shapefile. Areas of heavy human impact were selected and buffered to a distance of 10 kilometers, the furthest distance possible that wouldn't completely encompass all historic reef locations. Data on hydrology in southern Florida was acquired from Esri's ArcGIS hub as part of the National Atlas of the United States as a line shapefile. Terrestrial hydrology was used as a measure of sedimentation, pollution, and freshwater input from land. Rivers, streams, and canals were buffered to produce zones of high sedimentation risk. The hydrology layer was buffered to a distance of 10 kilometers, similarly to the land use dataset. The state of Florida maintains mooring buoys throughout the Florida Keys for use by recreational fishermen and scuba divers. These buoys represent offshore locations where human activity is higher. Data on these mooring buoys was acquired from NOAA's Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary as a point layer. The buoy locations were buffered to a distance of 500 meters. Bathymetry data was used to select areas between 0 and 20 meters in depth, the natural range for Caribbean acropora species. The two primary reef building species in the Florida Keys are Acropora palmata and Acropora cervicornis, both of which thrive at depths less than 20 meters. This data was acquired as a raster from the General Bathymetric Chart of the Oceans. Data on seafloor substrate was used to select areas with ideal benthic habitats. Acropora require solid rocky substrates for anchoring and support. Loose substrates reduce the coral stability and increases the risk of damage and burial during storms. This data was obtained as a polygon layer from the Florida Geographic Data Library. A suitability field was added to the attribute table and assigned values of 1 or 0 based on suitability for coral survival. The polygon layer was then converted to a raster based on these values in the suitability field. Turbidity is a measure of water clarity that is influenced by numerous factors. High turbidity levels reduce the ability of light to penetrate through the water column. Turbidity is measured with readings of KD 488, a measurement of light diffusion in water. This data was acquired from the University of South Florida as point data sourced from Modus Aqua satellite readings, similarly to the sea surface temperature data. Weekly KD 488 measurements over 1 year were averaged into a yearly mean for each point. A raster was created from the point data through inverse distance weighted interpolation. This raster was reclassified to show areas of ideal turbidity within the Florida Keys. All of the raster layers were reclassified to hold binary values of 1 or 0, representing suitable or unsuitable features. Using the raster calculator tool in ArcGIS Pro, all of the reclassified raster layers were multiplied together to create a single suitability layer. All of these buffered layers were combined using the merge tool, and the suitability raster was clipped to exclude all the areas within this buffer distance. This is the basic project workflow showing how each data layer was processed in ArcGIS Pro and combined into a single raster displaying ideal areas for coral outplant survival. These are the resulting suitability rasters for sea surface temperature variation and excessive sea surface temperature. All of the areas in green are considered suitable for coral outplant survival with this specific environmental parameter. For sea surface temperature variation, any area with less than 7 degrees Celsius variation was deemed suitable. Most corals thrive in a range of 6 degrees Celsius that can tolerate small variation beyond this. 6 degrees was found to be too restrictive, so 7 degrees Celsius was used as the ideal. For excessive sea surface temperature, the data was displayed in quartiles, and the lowest quartile was chosen as the ideal. This equated to no more than 5 weeks of sea surface temperature above 30.5 degrees Celsius in a time frame of 104 weeks. These maps show the results of the buffering of the land use and hydrology datasets. Any areas within the buffer are considered unsuitable for coral outplant survival due to proximity to human activity. The first map here shows the result of buffering the mooring buoys points and the second shows the suitability raster for ocean depth. Like with previous maps, areas within the buffer are unsuitable, and areas in green on the bathymetry map are considered suitable. These maps show suitability layers for the substrate and turbidity parameters. Turbidity suitability was determined using a maximum KD 488 value of 0.127, which has been shown to be the maximum turbidity level corals can tolerate before it impacts their growth. Once all of the suitability rasters were combined with the raster calculator tool and clipped to the buffer layer, the final area of suitability comprised 25 square kilometers off the coast of Key Largo in the northern Keys. There are a few potential issues with the selected area that must be acknowledged. The identified areas do not promote widespread larval dispersal due to the currents in the area flowing from south to north. There's limited reef areas north of this location for the current to carry larvae too. Since environmental parameters in this area are more ideal than in other areas of the Keys, these reefs may be less degraded than others. And finally, rapidly changing environmental conditions, such as climate change, may alter the results of this analysis. A few years from now, the environmental conditions may have changed enough to make the area selected unsuitable. There are a few ways this project could be expanded on in the future. One way is to apply the methodology to other regions of the world, such as the Great Barrier Reef or Indonesia. An alternative way to apply the methodology could be to reverse the suitability parameters in an attempt to locate the most heavily degraded reefs. And finally, this project could be used to study outbreaks of coral disease or bleaching. Incidents of coral disease or bleaching could be evaluated through geographic data on multiple environmental variables and spatially correlated with those variables. These results serve as an example of how GIS analysis can enhance coral reef restoration and will hopefully encourage wider use of GIS technologies to improve coral restoration success rates. Any questions?
All right, Matt, thanks for that interesting presentation. Looks like you have a question in the chat. If you could read that question and then answer it, that'd be great.
Okay. Yes, that should be possible with this methodology. That's a good idea for future research area.
Hey, Matt, this is Tim.
Hello.
I wonder if you could just expand a little bit more on your buffer and the 10-kilometer number. And I guess I'm specifically wondering what your thoughts are in terms of, do you think that distance is excessive or not?
It's hard to say. I did a lot of research into the best distance for that buffer, and I was unable to find any solid numbers for what is the ideal distance to of human activity from corals. So I made the assumption that the furthest distance possible would be ideal, which is where the 10 kilometers comes from, because that's the furthest distance you can go from Florida Keys land areas and still have reef to encounter. But it is possible that a shorter distance would be acceptable. But I just could not find any solid research on that topic.
If no one minds, I just want to follow up for a moment. Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm just curious because I know you did read a lot of papers, and at least within some of the ones that I'm familiar with, I mean, I agree what you're saying that there aren't any firm distances in the literature, but on the other hand, there are studies that talk about the distances between study reefs and communities on land, and often those distances are, you know, hundreds of meters, certainly closer than a kilometer, and you know, within closer distances, you can have healthy reefs. And so I'm not arguing with you that, you know, maximizing the distance is definitely going to be most beneficial. But on the other hand, there's then the logistics, right? Because now you're talking about, you're not snorkeling 10 kilometers to go plant those corals. Now you need a boat to do the work, as opposed to, you know, just walking into the water and swimming offshore and sticking them in the seafloor.
Yeah,
Anyway,
there are certainly.
I'm not criticizing the number. I'm simply, you know, pointing out that that's a part of this that we could work on more.
Yeah, I agree that some more research into that and trying to expand on that idea is a good idea. Certainly, as you mentioned, logistically, there may be limitations to going 10 kilometers out from shore to conduct restoration projects. So yeah, that's something I'd need to do some more research on, or something I'd like to expand on in the future.
Otherwise, I'm just going to close out by saying, and I'm saying this in front of everybody, that you did a really nice job, and I was particularly impressed with the data sets you were able to find, because, you know, at least early on, I helped you to some extent, but you were able to dig some stuff up that was really good. I mean, it really made it for an interesting project.
Thank you. All right, there's a question here in the chat. If I understand correctly, you manually calculate suitability using raster calculator. Did you apply weights to various layers to specify which factors may be more important? No, I stuck to a simple binary weighting, either suitable or unsuitable. Certainly, you could put in apply weights to the various factors, because some are more important than others. But there's a lot of nuance in that, and it can get really difficult to decide what exactly is more important and how exactly do you go about weighting these different factors. So speaking with Tim on this subject, we decided that a simple binary yes or no, suitable or unsuitable, was the idea, was the better way to go in this particular situation. Also, did you feel that the 500-meter resolution data was fine enough to represent coral habitats? I mean, I think it's, given the scale that we were covering, I feel like it was fine. I certainly would prefer a finer resolution, but given the data that was available, 500 meters was the finest I could go with the data that was available to me without introducing error.
Thanks again, Matt, for your presentation. If you'd like to put your email in the chat window, so if someone has a follow-up question, they can get a hold of you, that'd be great.
Okay.
Otherwise, we have our next presenter, which is Matt Brush. So Matt, if you want to stop sharing your screen, great. We see your screen, Matt. and your presentation. So whenever you're ready, Matt, go ahead and take it away. You may be muted, Matt. We don't hear anything audio-wise. Still no audio.
Hello, hello.
Yes, now we can hear you.
I had to switch speakers. Oh, very sorry. Let's see here.
All right, your
Okay.
presentation's up, so take it away.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Matt. My capstone project concerns the use of a web mapping application and the more efficient allocation of available resources to those in need. The application is intended to provide a single platform on which all resource providers can make their resources available. A broad overview of today's presentation. We'll start by looking at the purpose for this project and some of the social and environmental factors which led me to believe this project was necessary. Then we'll compare existing approaches to my approach. After that, we'll cover some of the major technologies used in the architecture of the application, followed by some examples of use and a live demonstration. Then we'll look at some hardships and constraints to the project's implementation, take a look into some of the many possible next steps, and finally, we'll open things up for questions. This project, it's intended to create a single platform on which all resources can be made available. By improving resource discovery, I hope to reduce the confusion found when navigating the resource provisioning landscape. Instead of calling, emailing, or messaging several different resource providers in order to locate a local resource, a user will simply turn on the app and quickly identify the resource they need. The project also intends to provide directions to available resources once they've been identified in order to help facilitate the acquisition of available resources. By improving both resource discovery and ease of acquisition, my project is able to better connect those in need with what they need. There's always been a need to help the less fortunate. I believe the next several years will demonstrate more need than ever. Natural disaster frequency is on the rise. My hometown burned down in 2018, and several other local communities have burned in the years since. The pandemic has led to much economic hardship among the lower and middle classes. The cost of living has greatly increased. In my area, people are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars over asking price on homes, and the rent rates are absurd. Outreach efforts are unorganized and too focused on navigating bureaucracy in order to secure their funding. The current approach of allocating resources to those in need is largely siloed. Each provider tends to have their own outreach strategy and act in isolation of all others. The place where there is overlap is in their competition for funding, which is usually tied to the Department of Housing and Urban Development's protocols for securing federal funding. I'm proposing an approach that maximizes the discoverability of available resources by clearly cataloging and displaying them all on a public-facing web app application. This approach brings all resource providers in the community together into one comprehensive provider network by creating one platform on which all their resources can be made available. This approach uses real-time resource availability data and proximity to connect those in need with what they need in the easiest possible way. This is a model diagram of user interactions with the application. On the right, you can see a resource provider updating their resource availability in real time, while on the left, there are several user types engaging with the web map application in order to find the local resource they're looking for. When considering what technologies to use for this project, I wanted to eliminate as many financial barriers to adoption as possible. It's proprietary laws and financial barriers that have created much of the need I'm trying to address with this project. So it would have been hypocritical to create a proprietary cost prohibitive solution. I chose to use technologies that are free to distribute and use, technologies that are lightweight and fast enough to keep up with user interactions, and technologies that are documented well enough to allow a novice like myself to successfully build. Getting into the components of the web map side of the project, I chose Postgres as the database for the application. Postgres is a relational database system that has been actively developed for over 30 years. It has a huge community and is very well documented. Once extended with PostGIS, it can handle spatial data and process it. I was able to serve spatial data directly from Postgres without the need for an additional spatial data server, which saved time and reduced complexity. For use in filtering, displaying, and carrying out tasks such as geolocation, I chose Leaflet. And I'll quote from their website, Leaflet is the leading open source JavaScript library for mobile-friendly interactive maps weighing just about 39 kilobytes of JavaScript. It has all the mapping features that most developers ever need. And it's also extendable with plugins, and it has a very active developer community. In order to direct app users to available resources, I needed to incorporate a technology capable of calculating routes. To achieve this functionality, I chose to use open source routing machine, or OSRM. Quoting their website, OSRM is a modern C++ routing engine for shortest paths in a road network. With OSRM, I was able to use OpenStreetMap data and calculate routes for driving, biking, and walking. This means that I'm able to update local roads and paths in OpenStreetMaps based on my local knowledge and see these changes reflected in the routing engine's returns. I needed to build a content management system in order to handle resource provider interactions with the database, and I decided to use PHP. As described on their website, PHP is a popular general purpose scripting language that is especially suited to web development. I used PHP as the server-side language for this application. Its functionality allowed me to limit access to information based on login credentials when accessing the admin portal. I found a great MOOC on Udemy where Michael Miller walks through the creation of a CRM for use in GIS using PHP and PDO. PDO is a database connection abstraction library. It stands for PHP data objects. I used a PDO connection in every user interaction with the database in both the web map and the admin portal. So the application is deployed in the cloud on a series of Ubuntu Linux servers. I wanted to keep the application as open source and independent as possible. So I limited dependencies on cloud specific services. I was able to produce a cloud agnostic application that can be deployed anywhere Linux servers are available. For the application's web server, I chose to use Apache, who according to their website are the world's largest open source foundation. The Apache open source HTTP server has been the most popular web server on the internet since 1996. I found that using containers greatly simplified the deployment of my application. I used Docker container images of OSRM and Postgres in my application. And after much trial and error, I'm now able to deploy a routing machine to a server in a matter of seconds. And that's thanks to Docker. This is a diagram of the overall architecture of the application. The application is composed of a total of 4 Linux server instances, 1 main server to host the web server and database, and 3 additional servers to host routing machines for each mode of transportation. PHP data objects are used to move data between the server side and the client side and vice versa. So I want to clarify that the homeless community itself is not the sole user of this application. The community at large is the user, and the application empowers them to help each other and themselves meet all basic human needs. Okay, let's try a live demo here. No promises. Let's see how it goes. So on a phone, the application looks something like this. And let's say you're riding your bike to a job interview, you lost your job at bartending because of COVID, and your neighborhood is stacking up leaves in the bike lane, waiting for the city to pick them up. And so you're riding in the street a little bit, a car comes by, swipes you into the leaves, and you break your finger in the gutter. So what to do now? You have no insurance. We'll go to Resource Hub, and you would go maybe look under medical resources, general medical, submit your query, you get 2 results. It's a little less intuitive at the moment than I would like it to be with these icons. Larger screens will automatically deploy this side panel, but on mobile it does not, but you can click it open and see what these different things mean. I like dark mode. So let's see. Proximity doesn't always work on computers. It works every time on cell phones. If you don't know where your desktop is located, you probably have other problems, but let's give it a try. Okay, no, not accurate enough. Okay, so let's just click and say, here's the Shalom Free Clinic. It offers medical. Here's its address. Here's its phone number. I can call them and see if they're open, or link to their website and see what their hours are. Hours are stored on the back end of this device. I just haven't found a space to jam them in yet. So from here, I want to get there. Let's get directions. I know it won't find me at the moment. If I was on my phone, it would. I can select location, and I know I'm over here by the park. And so I want to walk there because my bike's a little banged up. So I hit the walk icon, and it sends out a request to the API of the routing machine for biking, or for walking. If I wanted to bike, maybe my bike's not that dinged up, I can click this, similar path. Maybe the hit and run driver came back and offered me a ride to the medical care, and they have a car, and so we take this. And is what it's doing, it's sending out this URL request to the routing machine, and it returns this GeoJSON, which then is parsed into the geometry for the route and this turn-by-turn directions to your destination. Another example might be that you're out in the park and you're doing outreach to the homeless community, and a woman comes up and asks you for help finding a shelter bed because it's going to rain tonight. You would go housing, you would go shelters, you would submit. You get 2 responses, and let's see what this one is. This is the Jesus Center. Oh, they currently have 0 beds. Our other option is the Torres Community Shelter. They have 4, so let's send her there. So we'll call them, we'll have a bed held, and we'll get her over there. We can use directions to do that if we'd like. So on their end, at the Torres shelter, they're going to need to adjust their bed count. So to do that, they can come over and go through the provider portal and sign in there. Okay. Let's see here. So the social worker signs in, and then they can edit their availability, which includes hours, but also there's bed count up here, and they now have 3 available. And so the next person to sign in and try to look for shelter beds at the Torres shelter will see that there's only 3 available. Okay, so that's a couple examples. I mean, some of the additional things are, you can just broadly go by category. You can find yourself, as we showed. We can reset the zoom. Find resources just returns us to the main query panel. Yeah, so that's basically Resource Hub in its current incarnation. It is still a little buggy and needs some work. I hope that wasn't too painful. Let's move on. So constraints, there was definitely issues with communication, cooperation, and collaboration. I found it really difficult to find cooperation among the resource provider community. I'm not the best communicator or self-promoter, and most of the time I spent was developing the app itself. Competition between resource providers for funding, it bred suspicion between providers, and they kind of looked on me with suspicion as moving in on their possible funding, and I had a lot of unreturned emails and closed doors. There's an old story about a man cutting wood in the forest with a dull axe. Another man comes along and says, "Hey, why don't you take a minute to sharpen that axe?" The woodcutter replies, "I don't have a minute to spare. I have all of the wood to cut." Something like that. Well, everyone I reached out to was extremely busy securing funding and carrying out business as usual. They didn't have time to consider improvements to the dull and failing status quo. That's opinion. I'm in the process of incorporating public transit data. I'd like to prepare a beta release that isn't dependent on any resource provider interactions, that just the public can use and I can update to the best of my ability, and then show this to resource providers and try to improve my buy-in. I'd like to process the use data to see where demand outweighs availability. I think that this can demonstrate that through tracking in the database of consumption. I'd like to create a portal where providers can interact with donors and make donations seamless. I'd also like to look into more dynamic scalability. Since this isn't in the cloud, it is capable of dynamic scalability, which might allow moving into bigger markets, or just having one big platform for everywhere. Lessons. My favorite was that free and open source software is so empowering. It allows you to own your means of production. You can just get a busted old beat up laptop, throw Linux on it, and be doing anything you want with GIS, which is pretty cool. I'm really stoked about that. And I also found that you can use GIS to empower communities to transform in good ways and transform the environment in healthy ways. And I'm stoked about that. I found that the nonprofit industrial complex is a real thing. They're very caught up in chasing monies and grants and propagandizing themselves on social media. They're too much of their budget is spent on stuff like that, and they're not nimble, they're not agile, and they're not effective. They're diluted in their impact, and it really stinks and needs to change. I found that communication is crucial. My inability to communicate led this project to be less potent than it could have been, and at the moment it has no real community adoption or exposure. I'd like to thank my advisor, Emily Rosenman, whose knowledge of economic geography was a constant inspiration. Panos, whose insights into web mapping with open source technologies were critical. Ryan Baxter for providing guidance around cloud deployment. My academic advisor, Beth King, for attending meetings and letting me take 596C in order to accommodate the scope of this project. And to Udemy and Michael Miller for the several Udemy courses I took to supplement my web mapping knowledge. Are there any questions?
All right, Matt, thanks very much for a very interesting presentation. Looks like you have a question in the chat, so if you could read the question first and then answer it, that'd be great.
Okay, let's see here. Who would you envision would most use this platform? I ask because even in specific scenarios, like in a disaster, information needed by different agencies is important. Okay, so I see the user as social workers, maybe first point of contact with police. Instead of, move it along, they can say, move it along, and there's a bed available at the Torres shelter. I see just general people who asked for $1 can say, hey, there's a food bank over here. You want to ride? Or yeah, so the platform is for all to consume and to kind of link the community together, to empower everyone as one thing to help each other. The platform on the content management end is to unite all of the resource providers so they can communicate and have one place, one language they're talking, like a lingua franca between resource providers where everything is plain and not disjointed. Can I follow up on that in any way if that is unclear? I should say I would be happy to follow up on that in any way.
Yeah, after you get done, you can put your email contact in the chat window and people can follow up with additional questions if they have it.
Okay, great.
Yeah. I had a question. Who or what controls the population of the resource database? In other words, you had shelter locations and you talked about adding transportation resources and so forth. So how does that structure, or how does that data get populated?
So I built that into a Postgres database. So it's very rudimentary now with just what I could scrape online from old resources. I would like to make the backend use the local 211 data. They have a huge database with thousands of dollars worth of development in it that has up-to-date information on all kinds of resources. As far as transportation data, I have that for my local community and I put that in the database and have functionality built, but it's not advanced enough to deploy. I have like find the nearest bus stop to me, find the nearest bus stop to my resource, and find the route that connects the two, or find the route that connects to a bus stop that connects to the next stop. But I don't have it ready to deploy yet.
So yeah, the overarching question then is, who controls what resources are made available, and then what kind of power structure does that set for the?
I see. So it does need an administrator, and I was hoping that 211 would be that. They organize local resources in our community, and I think pretty much nationwide, a lot of nonprofits use 211 to connect people to resources, and it's largely phone driven. So in my case, whoever deployed the platform in their community would have an admin that would do it. And I believe most communities do have nonprofits such as 211 that are focused on connecting people to the disconnected resources in their community. So it would take an administrator. I am functioning as that in this situation. I update the stuff. They create a login credential. They sign up and it comes to me and I put them in the database and I set their permissions.
All right.
I have godmen on the admin side of things.
Yeah, I assume so, but I wanted to hear what kind of plan you had for that going forward.
Yeah, I can definitely limit the ability of each provider to update just their information. So that is built into it. Like I showed you the update of the beds, they can update their hours. Once I can develop it out to where they can update every bit of information about their own. And it will be just limited to their records in the database.
All right. Well, thanks again for your presentation. If you want to put your email in the chat, folks can follow up at a later date.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Next up, we have Camille Hartman. I pronounced her first name correctly.
Yes, he did. Thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead and start my share screen. Share.
All right, so we see your screen.
Works. All right.
Things look good over here, so go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Camille Hartman, and I'm going to present my capstone project, which looked at acute pesticides poisoning cases in Oregon and evaluated areas to focus on for further study. Before I begin, I'd like to thank my advisor, Dr. Joshua Inwood, for his guidance throughout this project. I'd also like to thank Dr. Jean Foster, who was instrumental in providing information and guidance on the topic of pesticides in Oregon. And lastly, I'd like to thank my husband for allowing me to be a student these past 2 years. His understanding and kindness has given me room to become a greater person. My presentation will go through some background information about pesticides poisoning and the ways in which state and federal agencies track these cases. Then I'll move on to talk about my research to further look into the relationship between land use, pesticides, and human health. Lastly, I'll talk about some of the challenges along the way before closing. I also look forward to some questions at the end of the presentation. Let's start off by talking about pesticides and the negative health outcomes from an exposure to these chemicals. Pesticides are a common treatment for agricultural sites and in people's homes. Applying pesticides to crops, plants, or greenery is a method for eliminating unwanted pests that could deteriorate the quality of the production. The consequence of exposure to these chemicals could result in serious negative health effects. Pesticides have been linked to several serious illnesses such as cancer, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, birth defects, as well as other chronic illness such as asthma. These long-term health effects could result from persistent exposure to residual pesticides from unwashed fruits, vegetables, or through pesticide spray drift. However, acute pesticides poisoning symptoms are tracked closely since symptoms present themselves within a shorter time span from a pesticides-related incident. Individuals who could have potential acute pesticides poisoning will have symptoms such as an eye and skin irritation, headaches, vomiting, or nausea. You can see from the diagram on the slide that there are several ways that an individual may be exposed to pesticides. The most common link to acute pesticides poisoning is through direct contact. Individuals working on farms, orchards, or other industrial growing fields are at a much higher risk for pesticides poisoning due to their close encounters with the harmful chemicals. Similarly, homeowners are also equally susceptible to pesticides poisoning. Researchers are finding that pesticides exposure can reach communities as far out as 500 to 1,000 meters from the original site of application. Therefore, pesticides exposure from a drift are difficult to track due to several factors pertaining to atmospheric influence, chemical compound of the pesticides used, and application methods. This makes it difficult to build a comprehensive database and potentially underestimates the rate of exposure to the surrounding communities. Several cogs are activated when an individual or a medical professional reports a potential acute pesticide poisoning. Under Oregon statute, physicians are required by law to report any diagnosis of potential pesticides poisoning to their local public health department or Oregon Health Authority. Depending on the nature and location of the incident, state agencies such as Oregon Department of Agriculture, Department of Forestry, Department of Environmental Quality, and so on, have certain protocols to follow to assess the situation. The honeycomb structure on the slide shows the components necessary in order to complete an assessment. Records, interviews, and other investigation activities are conducted to gather evidence. A case is considered as potential pesticides poisoning if symptoms show 1 ocular symptom, 1 dermal symptom, or 2 general/systemic symptoms such as coughing or vomiting. Once all the necessary information have been gathered and shared with the Pesticide Analytical and Response Center, or PARC, under the Oregon Department of Agriculture agency, it is evaluated against the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health's Sensor Pesticide Case Classification Matrix, as shown on the slide. The numbers correspond to the scoring required for consideration within the category, where 1 has all the necessary evidence and criteria, and a score of 4 is given if there is insufficient data. An incident is given a classification of definite, probable, possible, or suspicious, depending on the scoring received in the 3 classification criteria. I bring up the reporting and assessment procedure because it is possible that in addition to incomplete data due to factors such as atmospheric influence, application method, etc., this process may not allow for a subset of the population to be captured in the reporting. This is where I believe that an environmental justice lens may be appropriate to ensure that all communities could report their potential acute pesticides poisoning incidents, even if they are not able to visit a physician to confirm symptoms, access information on how to report symptoms from an English written pamphlet, or do not feel comfortable providing personal information to government officials. Coming back to my research, I have therefore conducted an evaluation of areas in Oregon where more diligent outreach to communities might be necessary so that PARC can provide a more complete data about acute pesticides poisoning in Oregon. My research aims to answer where there are locations that have the highest risk of potential exposure to pesticides. My goals are to isolate areas near crops that have a high percentage of susceptible communities using empirical and descriptive analysis. I've gathered available data that speaks to the different components of this analysis. The crop data layer was derived from the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service and provides the layer for the different crops in Oregon. There were 95 different land cover classifications, which I further binned into logical crop types. The Census Bureau's latest population data was used to visualize the population of Oregon by race and ethnicity. The 2020 census data was also used to interpolate estimated population for the case rate by county data. The case rate by county data was provided by the Oregon Health Authority's Pesticide Exposure Safety and Tracking Program. My research focused on cases reported in 2017, 2018, and 2019. This 3-year trend follows the biennium reporting method that Oregon Health Authority uses. Reported acute pesticides cases are available to the public by Oregon Health Authority. What you are seeing on the slide is a screen capture of their dashboard, which shows pesticide poisoning by demographics for 2018 to 2019. A few things of note is a disclaimer at the bottom of the page. Cases that are fewer than 6 are suppressed for confidentiality. Another observation relates to poisoning cases by race, where only white or unknown race are represented in the reported data. Translating the data onto a map, I took the average data from 2017 to 2019 to get the average cases for all 3 years. In addition, the cases were evaluated by rate per 100,000 population. This method follows OHA's 2014 report of acute pesticides poisoning in 2009 and 2011. The average rate was given a rank where 1 indicates the highest rate of reported pesticides poisoning cases. Notice the counties with unknown rates east of the Cascade Range. These counties have an unknown value due to the suppressing of data that are less than 6 cases. And therefore I was not able to factor this into the average calculation. Within the counties that received a rank, there is a clustering pattern along the coastal range and west of the Cascade Range. The top 3 counties with the highest rate for the 3 years are all located along the coast. Coos County, who ranked first, had an average rate of 20.69 per 100,000 with an average yearly reported case of 13. Equally of note is Tillamook, which within the 3 years had reported cases in 2018 only. However, due to their low population, the number of reported cases weighed heavily for the average rate ranking. Outside of the top 3 counties, the other 6 ranking counties all had less than 2 cases per 100,000 average rate. Looking at Oregon's population distribution, it had an interesting population density profile where majority of the population live along the Cascade Range. Further east of Oregon are low population within larger areas. The map on the left shows the total population symbolizes graduated color map with transparency settings set on the size of the land. The higher the land area, the more it is transparent. The data is in block group resolution and population data attributed to the layer. The map on the right depicts Oregon's population by race and ethnicity. The transparency is also set to the land area. Notice where there is a percentage of the population who live in larger land areas. There's also a high clustering of non-white population that live in the upper left corner of the state. Overlaying the 3-year pesticide poisoning case rate over the population data shows inconclusive results. For example, focusing on counties with the highest case rate, represented by ranks of 1 through 3, Coos, Lincoln, and Tillamook, show block groups where the population subset identify as a person of color. However, the data presented on the map does not necessarily correlate because it is unknown where in the reported county each poisoning case occurred. Additionally, correlating population data at county level aggregates the data to the extent that could potentially minimize underserved communities. Nevertheless, these counties do have percentages of their population who may not be able to easily access the reporting procedure outlined earlier in the presentation. Furthermore, because there is a lack of precise data, it only shows the importance in performing further evaluation to ensure that all population are represented. This map shows the big crop types in Oregon. Crop categories are shown on the left side of the map. The categories were created to further simplify the map to show specific crops in logical categories. Overlaying the land use data in Oregon, you'll notice a lot of forestry areas on the west side. These also seem to follow the counties with reported acute pesticide cases. To confirm my observation, I ran the summarize within tool to obtain the majority crop type in each county. The result shows 3 major crop types, forest, pasture, and shrubland. Western Oregon are predominantly forested, while the eastern side have majority shrubland. The areas along the Columbia River are predominantly used for pasture land use. The counties that rank for the average case rate all show that forest is the category that is most prevalent within those counties. Exploring the top 3 highest ranked counties, the table shows the breakdown of land use by crop category. This data is also depicted in the line graph on the lower right of your screen. About 62% of land use in Coos, Lincoln, and Tillamook counties are dedicated to forestry. Shrublands and developed spaces are the 2nd and 3rd highest percent of land use within all 3 counties. The data presented only provides metrics for further exploring the counties that had pesticides poisoning reported. This data is insufficient to make a correlation between the reported cases and potential pesticide source. The overall results of this research provides a small glimpse into the many factors of a pesticides poisoning incident. While it may seem that pesticides poisoning are concentrated in counties west of the Cascade Range, this is only due to the ways in which Oregon Health Authority provides data, which is that cases less than 6 are suppressed for confidentiality reasons. Having a more complete data could provide additional interesting insight into other areas with potentially high rate of cases per their population. It could also show whether other crop types could be considered for further exploration of its potential for exposure to its surrounding community. Furthermore, the variance in population does influence the calculation of rate per population. While rural communities located in eastern Oregon counties may have reported less than 6 cases, the amount of pesticides poisoning could weigh heavily against a smaller rural population. This information is especially valuable when evaluating cases on a multi-year basis where counties with consistent reported poisoning cases could mean consistent exposure to pesticides to those communities. The graph above shows the variance in the average population between 2017 and 2019. Multnomah County, which is undoubtedly the metropolitan center, had the highest average population, followed by a sharp decline in average population for the rest of the counties in Oregon. There were a number of obstacles in this research that limited the results. First, the large data files of the crop data made it difficult to perform certain geoprocessing successfully. With over 11 million records, my computing device was not able to handle some of the data analysis. Therefore, a more precise location of pesticides poisoning incidents could help to further narrow the study area. Additionally, the lack of pesticides application data inhibited my ability to perform ground truth analysis. Ground truth analysis could confirm suspected sources of pesticides poisoning source. Lastly, although reported cases are available at the county level, the lack of access to a complete data set skews the results to only show counties with cases that are higher than 6. This research leads to potential future work. I wasn't able to identify specific areas within the counties that have a potential risk for exposure. However, it would be worthwhile to look further into these counties to gain better insight into pesticides poisoning cases. State agencies may have more complete data that could enrich the results from my research. It could also provide the necessary data to perform a proximity analysis and correlate land use to known cases of pesticides poisoning. Lastly, coming up with a hardware solution that can enable analysis on large data sets. And with that, here are my references, and I'll go ahead and open it up for questions.
Thanks, Camille, for a great presentation. Certainly one that's very important for the health of the community. While we're waiting for questions to show up, I'll have a questions. The pesticide data that you collected, the only attribute information of value was whether or not a poisoning did occur or not. There was nothing about what kind of pesticide, the kind of poisoning that took place. It was just a simple yes, no.
Yeah, the pesticide data is very limited or heavily guarded. I don't know which one is which, but the available data that Oregon Health Authority provides is just simply whether or not there was a reported case. It was also unclear whether or not this was evaluated against that classification metrics of whether or not these were all definitively a pesticides case or probable or not likely.
Well, I'm sure there's multiple factors at play here controlling what information gets put out about pesticide poisoning.
Yeah, and in addition, I should also mention that because of the lack of pesticide application data, which would be a data where it tells you when a pesticide was applied, it could also include the type of chemical. It was really difficult to say, okay, just because Coos County ranked the highest for the 3-year average, does that mean that Coos County will always had the highest potential for pesticides exposure or residents in that county? It could just be like a single incident that happened in that year.
Right, yep. Any questions for Camille? All right. Well, Camille, if you want to put your email into the chat window. Someone can contact you later with some questions.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Milan Kukvas.
Hey guys, give me just 1 sec.
We hear you loud and clear.
Awesome, that's good news. Just 1 second, and then let me know if just my. Okay,
There we
you
go.
guys, you
Yes.
can see this thing. Awesome. Awesome.
Yep.
And I have to apologize for any background noises, not in my control, so I'm so sorry. Anyway, so good afternoon. My name is Milan Čukvas, and this is my capstone project, the role of location intelligence in decision-making process, the case for water industry. I know the title might sound a little bit complicated, but that's just because the topic itself is complicated, the part that refers to the case for water industry. But the project itself is a simple one because it's a product-based, and it was about developing a GIS tool, a dashboard that would be easy to update, maintain, and that would allow for customizable design that could be scaled up or scaled down, I'm sorry, based on the scope, and then used in various industries that could benefit from location intelligence, of course, with the water industry being one of them. The reason why I chose the water industry is because my line of work. So most of my career is actually in this field. And for the last 3 years, I'll be employed by American Water, which is the largest water utility company in the US. On this slide, you can find a statement that actually is from American Water website. If you scroll to About Us page, and in my opinion, it does represent the company's business model. So all these highlighted phrases such as prevent pollution, promote sustainability, enhance the natural environment, and being a stewards of the communities are not really buzzwords, and they're not just phrases, but they are in the center of American Water's everyday business practices. However, this being said, there is one aspect of a business in which these values are not directly considered. They're not neglected, they're just not considered. And that's the process of acquiring the new water systems as a part of expanding company's footprint. The reason is actually the nature of the process. All decision-making in those early stages is based on the handful of available data that's almost exclusively financial. And in all honesty, that's what I find out when I start dealing with this more closely. That's really the only data that's available. All other information, all other information such as they're more technically driven, such as the nature of, the state of the system, the age of the system, used materials, the geometry, and even something simple as the full asset inventory is not available until the closing date. And even then, it's questionable because most of the time these systems are run down and not really, all this information is not really available. So, however, and this is really big, however, in the backbone of my research, all that information can be inferred by using location intelligence. So from beginning of my research, which was back in Geography 850, the goal of my idea was to show that location intelligence can be useful in the acquisition process, and then if applied properly could allow decision makers to accurately predict investment outcomes based not only on the financial data, but also based on some socioeconomic characteristics of the area, environmental, and of course, some spatially driven information. So for the next, 14, 15 slides, we're going to be talking about project objective, research method, results. That's actually a dashboard. And I don't know if you guys heard, but the Amazon servers are down. That was just the news like 20 minutes ago. So hopefully I'll be able to start my dashboard so you can see it. If not, I do have a screenshot. But besides that, I'm also going to be talk a little bit about challenges and limitations, if you have time, about references, and then of course questions at the end. So the project objective was to review existing acquisition process, and its current acquisition process is divided in 3 stages: preliminary, negotiation 1, and due diligence. But just the first one, the preliminary one, is the part of my research scope. The other 2 are in the realm of business dealings. They're unique to American waters, so not really in the public realm, cannot be really discussed. The objective also was to create, like I said, to review the system, to review existing process, and then to create a method alongside the tool that would take non-financial factors in consideration in order to come up with the right decision. Basically, the intent was to create a set of requirements with assigned benchmark values to each of them, then compare the field data with those requirements, score each result, and then based on the overall weighted score, determine if the system for sale is a viable financial opportunity. If that's the case, then based on all the data that was indirectly obtained by using location intelligence, and that's mostly about the state of the system, characteristics of the community, and some environmental trends, would actually help, again, decision makers to predict what's needed as far as the future system designs, and then also to predict investments needed to support the system and the community as well. To verify that my methodology work, I decided to use City of Mount Pulaski as a study area. Mount Pulaski is in the central Illinois in the Logan County. And the reason for it, because when I started this back in Geography 850, American Water engaged with the City of Mount Pulaski in actually acquiring their systems. So even though my project is done, hence this presentation, right? And I already got my result. If based on my methodology, City of Mount Pulaski is a viable financial opportunity or not, I cannot verify that information until the closing is done, which is closer to the end of the year. Methodology itself, it's straightforward and consists of 5 steps, with each step building on the previous one. So in order to establish a set of requirements, assign benchmarks, and then devise questions within the data assessment part, it was needed to identify data that's available and the verifiable sources. Because I was trying to devise the questions that actually we can come up with the answers and not. So something that's not philosophical, but it's more practical. After that, most of the data, of course, came in the formats that are not the GIS. So it was needed to transform them so they can be then fed to my output, which is a GIS dashboard. And then finally, like that, come to some conclusions about Mount Pulaski. So data gathering part was my biggest struggle because I was trying again to identify sources that are verifiable, because we all know just because it's sitting on the internet doesn't mean it's true, doesn't mean it's correct. So I need some level of confidence the data that I'm going to be using is already quality checked and assured. Because again, another thing that we all GIS people know, it's super easy to lie and with the maps and the statistics. So after extensive research, I decided to kind of stick with the governmental websites. So most of my data, actually all my data, it's coming from sites like a controller website, EPA, NOAA, Census, and some local government websites like on the county level was assessor's office, and then some information came directly from the City of Mount Pulaski. In addition to these sources, one of the pillars of my research was to develop solid understanding about the community. So I was looking how to create a community profile. So I found consumer spending habits and life stage group classification really helpful. So for those 2, I resort back to 2 private sources, which is Claritas Prism. It's a marketing research company, and then Esri itself through their business analyst app. There's two other pieces of data that I was using, and that was the list of customers that came directly from City of Mount Pulaski, and then the other one was some data that came directly from American Water, such as their service territories. Once when I was satisfied with the sources, satisfied with the data that I had in front of me, the other step was actually to try now to devise those requirements, assign benchmark values, and then come up with the questions. So in front of you, there is 11 of them, and they're actually segregated in 5 groups. The first one is dedicated to financial group. The other 2 are actually belong to spatial group. Then there is I think 2, yes, they belong to socioeconomics, just 1 regarding the condition of the system, and the last 5 belongs to environmental. All these requirements, again, are strictly based on what was out there, what's free to obtain from those verified websites. As far as the criterias and those assigned benchmark values, those were more part of the rule of thumbs approaches established from previous acquisitions. Again, I do have to say that these 2 first steps were the most complex and took most of my time in the research. I think that all my paper, it's like almost 40% of my paper deals with this. And that's just because of the specificity of this topic. So the acquisition process for the water industry. However, the next 2 steps, converting data and then designing the dashboard. So the output, they were GIS based and they went really quickly. The guiding principle for both steps was to create something that's easy to adjust and maintain. And it could be done by low-level GIS users. And again, it was really important to find a way to display results in a manner that can be easily understood. So all GIS work can be depicted in 7 simple steps. So this is not really heavy GISing at all. So one of the steps was actually geocoding, so bringing all these addresses as a map display, then enriching data sets by joining the data sets from the various sources. Then it was actually also needed to create 2 specific data sets. One of them was a service area, and then the grid area around service area. Service area is nothing else but the envelope that kind of encompasses all customers and the whole geometry of the system. As far as the grid area, that was used later on in analytical portion because it was converted into a raster data set, and then by using some raster calculations, I was able to come up with some conclusions that I will be showing on the map. Similar to GIS editing, the analytical process, like I said, was easy, and then the dashboard itself, creation of the dashboard was easy. So what you see here, the image on the very top, this is simplified version. So there's 5 different data sources. They're all subject of GIS editing and some analytical processes, and then they're displayed on the dashboard, right? Now, dashboard doesn't need to be everybody's choice, viewing data. So there's also option to export the data in some type of reporting, like most likely like a simple scorecard. Now, this portion between bringing the data into dashboard is a little bit more complicated than just like one straight arrow. So for all of you that are not familiar with Esri's ArcGIS online process, but actually what's needed is to grab all tabular data and shapefiles, bring it into ArcGIS online environment, convert data into hosted features, then load the data into ArcGIS web maps. Web maps are actually then used as a base for web applications, 1 or more than 1. All analytical work can be done within the web applications, and then once when the final product is done, it could be viewed on the dashboard. Okay, so I'm gonna try the dashboard, but while I'm doing this, I'm gonna explain one more thing. So do you guys see what's going on right now? I'm trying to log into Esri's ArcGIS Online, or that's just me seeing it?
Yeah, you're just seeing that.
Okay, it's just me. Okay, so okay. what would be the best way? Should I just go back and use the screenshot shown on the slide instead of changing the screens?
Yeah, that'd be okay.
Okay, let's do that then. Okay, so on the left side, you actually, that's the screenshot of the dashboard. But the most important part, the guiding principle while I was working on this, is to create the output, the result that's easy to understand. So I decided to combine numerical value with a scalar scheme. And the numerical value goes from 0 to 3, 0 being the less favorable opportunity, 3 being the most favorable opportunity. And then the colors, since we are all kind of conditioned to follow the traffic light approach, so red means stop, green means go, I decided to go with a color scheme that goes from dark red to dark green, dark red being assigned to the 0 value, dark green being assigned to a value of 3, and then everything between, right? So in the case of Mount Pulaski, the score was 2, and then of course corresponding color was one of these shades of green. Now, the dashboard itself. So what you see here on the left side is the actual dashboard. And the way how it's designed was based on the input that I got from our business development people, because certain things they wanted to see in the dashboard. So there's on the left upper corner, there is a list of 11 questions based on those 11 requirements with corresponding answers. Just underneath, you can see the weighted values assigned to each of these answers. And then of course, corresponding answer was 2. The map in the very middle is actually just representation of Mount Pulaski and its location in Logan County. And the idea was not only to see the number, not only to see the color of indicator, but also to look into city limits as well. And the color should be going again from dark red to green, and it should correspond to whatever is assigned to the number 2. On the very right of the dashboard, there is actually a set of 4 maps, and all these maps are developed based on the raster calculations, and their purpose is just to supplement decision making and all these answers shown on the left side. So one of the maps is dealing strictly with so-called non-revenue water. Some of them are dealing directly with lead presence in the system. Some of them are dealing with community profile. And then of course, there is some just strictly spatial maps that are showing the location of the newly developed service area comparing to existing ones. Challenges and limitations. Data, because again, none of this stuff was collected by me. So I have to trust that what I'm getting from government sites is actually verified. My biggest mistake, my biggest concern is that if data is not correct, then the results will be skewed. The other challenge, and this is more limitation, is actually I could not really go into depth about 2 other steps within the current acquisition process. But one thing that I can share with you is, since both of them are passed and we're waiting now for the closing, some information that came from me to me from the negotiation step slightly knocked down my score to 1.8. But then thanks to some other information that came within due diligence, my score went back to 2.1. So I guess my 2, it's kind of, if nothing else, I can take this as that my methodology works. The last limitation was actually the Esri software as well. We are Esri shop, and I do like Esri dashboards, but I don't think that Esri dashboard is really the best choice of software for this application. Currently, myself and my team, we are looking into either using Microsoft BI reporting or maybe even Safe FME, but that's something that's going to be our next steps. All my literature was there to actually educate me, and it's grouped in 4 groups. So I have a financial literature that I was using to understand why is just that used in the current process. Then I was looking into some technical specs about systems, how they were changing throughout the eras and depending on the geography. Socioeconomic literature was more used to have a better understanding about the community movement. and if there's any correlation between why people are choosing to leave the areas or move to areas based on the climate change or environment situation. And then research principles, there was more because I was really struggling to kind of find my way through what specific methodology to use. I do have to say thank you, Dan Steiner, for helping me, keeping me on track and help me to navigate the maze of my brain. So that would be my presentation. Please, if any questions, I'm more than happy to answer.
Thanks for that great presentation, Milan.
Thank you.
While we're, looks like someone has a question for you.
Yes, you said that you use the cloud of the number of cloud tools to open app and dashboard. Which one give you the most trouble? I really can't say that any of them specifically gave me any trouble because they're so basic. And if I have to judge my work, I would say it's rudimental. So there's definitely ways of improving this. And that's why I said, I don't think that Esri, even though it's easy to use and easy to display data, I think that we might switch the software packages and try with something else.
All right, to keep things on schedule, thanks again, Milan, for your presentation. If you could put your email in the chat window, if someone has a question afterwards, they can contact you there.
Here we go. I'm gonna stop sharing it now. Thank you guys again.
Thank you. And next up, Frank DeChico.
Hi, yeah. How's my audio doing? I'm wearing a headset. Just want to make sure it sounds okay.
Audio is fine.
Perfect. All right, let me share my screen here. Go to presentation mode.
All right, looks good on this end. So whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks. So good afternoon. My name is Frank DeChico, and today I will be presenting my capstone project titled Nocturnal Tornadoes, Determining Causal Factors. During this presentation, I'll begin with an introduction and background on tornadoes. I'll also discuss the human impacts of tornadoes and briefly describe the tornado warning system. Before discussing the specifics of my project, I'll provide some details on nighttime tornadoes. The second half of the presentation will focus on my project, specifically the objective, conclusions, and discussion. On average, the US experiences about 1,000 tornadoes per year, over 900 more than the next closest country. The map on the right is a point density distribution of tornadoes between 1950 and 2019 using data from NOAA. The highest frequency of tornadoes is found in the middle of the country, concentrated in what is known as Tornado Alley. The US is in a unique geographical position where cool, dry air from the north collides with warm, moist air from the Gulf, creating the recipe for severe storms, spawning tornadoes with the highest density seen in the area around Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Now that we know where and why tornadoes impact the United States, how does that translate to people? Tornadoes account for roughly $400 million in property damage annually, along with nearly 80 deaths and 1,500 injuries. We can see in the two charts on the right how tornado fatalities and the number of tornadoes have varied across the recorded data set from 1950 to 2019. Other factors are important to consider in relation to tornado impact. For example, studies have found that tornadoes that occur at night are twice as deadly as those during the daylight hours. Keep this in mind, we'll be coming back to it. With all this in mind, it is worth noting that over the course of tornado record keeping, injuries and fatalities due to tornadoes have decreased. Studies have shown that nighttime tornadoes are up to twice as deadly as their daytime counterparts. But why? Due to normal sleeping patterns, people are less likely to receive warnings during a nocturnal tornado event. Additionally, tornadoes are more difficult to see during the nighttime hours. Moreover, the public is less likely to be in safer locations, such as schools or places of work, which are reinforced steel structures, than at night, and are more prone to weaker building structures, such as mobile homes. Finally, and surprisingly, tornado warning sirens are deployed to mitigate tornado hazards during outdoor daytime activities. Therefore, they're less effective at night when more people are inside of their homes. So, can we warn the public more effectively during a nighttime tornado event? Well, what is a tornado warning? Tornado warning is issued by the National Weather Service when a tornado is either indicated through spotter networks or on radar. Typical warning duration usually lasts around 30 minutes. The first tornado warning was issued in 1948, and from that time until 2017, warning polygons were issued based on county boundaries. So what that means is that every point in the county would have been under a tornado warning, even if parts of the county were not at risk. However, in 2017, the warning polygon was modified to be storm-based, meaning that only areas that were directly at risk of being impacted by a tornado were warned. Additionally, in June 2012, the National Weather Service began using wireless emergency alerts to push extreme weather warnings to mobile devices. It's also worth noting that warning lead times for tornadoes drastically increased from roughly 5 minutes in 1986 to an average of 13 minutes in 2004. My capstone project will attempt to use spatial statistics to predict the causal factors of nocturnal tornado fatalities. There have been a number of studies conducted around the nature of nocturnal tornadoes. Ashley et al. Published a paper in 2008, which found that nocturnal tornado fatalities are continuing to increase through the last half of the century through 2007. They also determined that geography plays a role in nocturnal tornado deaths, as their study found that the southeastern portion of the US experienced higher fatality rates from nocturnal tornadoes. Additional studies determined that atmospheric conditions for nocturnal tornadoes are unique by comparison. Warnings for nocturnal tornadoes have also been studied, but it was determined that more research was necessary to draw any conclusions. The specific objective of my project will be to determine any patterns between nocturnal tornadoes and demographic data by applying spatial statistics. Additionally, I will attempt to recreate the Ashley et al. Results and expand on their results with the current data set. Finally, I will apply spatial regression to attempt to predict fatal nocturnal tornado events. So let's take a look at the data that's being used in my analysis. First, initial tornado touchdown points were collected from NOAA's Storm Prediction Center. The data set again spans from 1950 through 2019 and includes fatalities, magnitude, and time of day within the metadata. The data does have some interesting features and trends, which include an increase in lower magnitude tornadoes throughout the data set. Additionally, social vulnerability data was downloaded from the CDC website, which includes all county data for the US. On this slide, we see the overall SOVI score, with the darker red counties being the most vulnerable. We chose to perform our analysis at the county level due to account for things like political affiliation and funding appropriation that can easily be aggregated at the scale. SOVI data is also broken into themes, which we'll discuss in more detail with the results and conclusions. The methodology for my project begins with gathering and visualizing the data using Esri desktop. We then reproduced the results from Ashley et al. And added the preceding 12 years of data since the paper was published to determine if any new trends have emerged. The next challenge was to deal with time. NOAA presented each tornado in their data set in Central Time, which posed challenges relating to time zones and daylight savings time. To address this, we used RStudio to convert all tornado times to local solar time. By converting to local solar time, we were basically saying that for each tornado recorded, the sun will be at the same point overhead at that time. After addressing the time of each tornado, we aggregated the data to the county level so that we can proceed with a statistical analysis. At this point, we can proceed with statistical analysis in RStudio to attempt to predict the percentage of fatal tornado events in each county. Our first analysis was to reproduce the Ashley et al. Results. The chart on the right shows the original output from Ashley et al. The chart on the left is updated from our analysis with statistics for nocturnal tornadoes. The green bar denotes the percentage of fatal nocturnal tornadoes. The red bar is percentage of nocturnal tornadoes. And finally, the purple bar depicts percentage of nocturnal fatalities. The purpose of this step is to see if any trends have changed since the paper was published. NOAA is updating and massaging the tornado data used for the analysis regularly Tornadoes are added, duplicates are removed, and metadata is modified as necessary. We do see similar results in duplicating the Ashley results. There's an increase in the percentage of nocturnal tornado fatalities through 2007. However, when adding observed tornado data from 2008 through 2019, there are differences in the observed trend from the Ashley paper. It's also interesting to note that on the heels of 2011, which was one of the most active and destructive years on record for tornadoes, the period between 2012 and 2018 was much below average in terms of overall tornado activity. More granular view of the data in 5-year intervals can be found here. In the 5-year data, we can see that the intervals matter, and the aggregation is important in drawing conclusions from the data. Next, we'll be trying to predict the percentage of fatal nocturnal events per county as seen in the map on this slide. We'll be doing so using a variety of predictors, including SOVI theme data and percentage of people living in mobile homes. Maps depicting these predictors can be seen on this slide. Next, we brought the tornado data into RStudio and performed a best subsets regression, which compares all possible models that can be created based on the provided set of predictors. Note is that our scale of analysis is a single county, and our response variable is the percentage of fatal events per county. We see the model is only able to predict 15% of the percentage of fatal nocturnal events per county. However, if we look at the AIC, which is the Akaike Information Criterion, which is a method for evaluating how well a model fits the data, we see that model 4 is the lowest AIC. This means that model 4 is explaining the greatest amount of variation using the fewest independent variables. Therefore, we can say that this set of data and variables, model 4 is the best fit. Let's take a closer look at how well model 4 performs. Here we see residuals, coefficients, and R-squared. We examine the residuals, we can determine the difference between the actual observed response values, in this case, the percent of fatal events per county, and the response values that the model predicted. In the map in the lower right, we do not see any strong patterns in the residuals. However, we would ideally see a symmetrical distribution across the residual points. Our results are not strongly symmetrical, meaning that our model predicts certain points that fall far away from actual observed points. Next, we can see that magnitude is a strong indicator for percentage of fatal events, denoted by the 3 asterisks. Although in this model, we are only counting for an increase of 7% fatal events for each increase in magnitude. For example, going from an EF1 to an EF2 tornado. Looking at our R-squared values, we see the values around 0.15 or 15%. R-squared is a measure of how well the model is fitting the actual data. We would like to see our R-squared number closer to 1, as this would explain the observed variance in our response variable, again, the percentage of fatal events. So now we'll exclude counties with lower than 10% fatal nocturnal tornado events from our model, see if we can make a better prediction and improve model performance. When excluding counties with less than 10% fatal events, we're now explaining just over 50% of the variance. Again, we see the best subset regression with the predictors used. We can now look again at the AIC scores to find the most suitable model. Now model 8 has the lowest AIC, indicating that it is the best fit for our data and explaining the greatest amount of variance using the fewest independent variables. So let's take a closer look at model 8. We again see that magnitude is a strong, the magnitude of a tornado is a strong predictor in the percent of fatal events. In this model, we can see that there's a 16% increase for each magnitude increase in tornado strength. Interestingly, the region of the country proves to be significant in this model. However, it is the Northeast that has a strong influence on the model. This could be due to a variety of factors, and it would be possible to rerun the model while excluding things like counties with less than 1 or 2 nocturnal tornadoes to see if the Northeast is no longer a significant influence in the model. Looking at our residuals, the map again shows no strong patterns. See that there is not a strong symmetry, so our model is still predicting certain points fall far away from our observed points. On the other hand, the adjusted R-square is close to 52%, indicating we can more strongly explain the observed variance in our response variable. Another interesting finding is that in the first model, SOVI theme 1 was a strong indicator of the percent of fatal events. SOVI theme 1 deals with socioeconomic status and includes things like poverty level, unemployment, and income. In the second model, when removing the counties with lower than 10% of fatal events, the variable is no longer a strong indicator. Additionally, neither model found home type, in particular mobile homes, to be a strong indicator. So the findings from the analysis reveal that there appears to be a relationship between certain social vulnerabilities and the percentage of fatal nocturnal events per county. However, more research should be conducted as population demographics continue to shift, potentially put more people in areas prone to nocturnal tornadoes. Additionally, as more data is collected since the enhancements made to the warning system, further research should be conducted to determine if these enhancements have helped to reduce overall fatal tornadoes, but particularly fatal nocturnal tornadoes. And I thank everyone for coming out for my presentation. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.
All right, Frank, thank you very much for your presentation. That was a great job.
Sure, thanks.
As we wait for folks to put a question up for your presentation, I was wondering, sort of in kind of a retrospect look, the method of delivery of these warnings, is that a factor that you could investigate a bit further? I know there's no radio, and there's web broadcasts and so forth. Do you think that has any the kind of format that the warning gets disseminated through it? Does that have any impact on your study?
Yeah, so it was one thing that we considered, and we could have included in some of the analysis was bringing in broadband coverage to see what, how that impacts and how that plays a role at the county level in terms of the new dissemination of warnings since 2012 via mobile phones. That seems like it would be a more effective way to warn people at night. But then again, you have people to sometimes turn their phones off or, silence their phones, and those warnings might not come across. So it would be interesting to see, how things like broadband connectivity and percentage of people that have mobile devices, which has to be astronomical at this point, how those things would impact, the fatality rate per county.
Yeah, and then I guess you'd also have to know the percentage that have the mobile phones, how many actually have an app that would receive and broadcast that warning.
Yeah, so the way that it's through the research, the way that it seems is that they're pushed just via what's it called, the emergency alert system. So it would be like if you were getting Amber Alerts over your phone. So I'm not necessarily sure if an app is necessary for that, but it would be something that I would have to look into. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Sure. Okay, so I see a question here. Which of your data sets was the hardest to come by or work with? They were, I wouldn't say any of them were particularly hard to work with. The most difficult thing to address was the time for each tornado. As I mentioned, NOAA records in that data set, each tornado is recorded in Central Time, which made it difficult if you're talking about a tornado that occurs in Los Angeles or somewhere in Pacific Time. The sun isn't at the same point overhead at those times. So how you define a nocturnal tornado becomes challenging. So we needed to transform all that data into local solar time so that the sun would be essentially overhead at that time for every single tornado that struck. And that was a fairly complex issue that we struggled with getting through using RStudio. But once we got it into that format, then the analysis became relatively straightforward. But I would say that was probably the most difficult part of the analysis.
Any other questions for Frank? You want to put your email address in the chat window so folks can contact you if they want to follow up. All right, very good. So I'd like to thank all of our presenters for attending today's presentation and giving their excellent capstone projects. Thanks to all that showed up to ask questions and hear what our fabulous students have to say. We have another round of 596B presentations Thursday. Take note that the start time will be at 11:40 instead of noon, like today's was. So put that on your calendar. Otherwise, thanks again for everyone and have a great day.